I'll just say this. Let me start this off in the most like fanboy type way. I was always a huge James Bond fan. I mean, I still am. I even remember my father watching some of these films. In the 80s when I guess VHS was just coming out. I remember him watching, From Russia with Love and Dr. No and Goldfinger and things like that, and kind of seeing them. And then I remember when I was in middle school or high school, I kind of got, in the 90s, I kind of got into it again and started watching them. And, I still enjoy them today now that I'm in my 30s. This is really pathetic in a way. I don't know. But I think, and I've heard this statistic that 1 in 4 people on the globe have seen a James Bond film. And I think also, what we would say is that if a figure like James Bond becomes a legend, like if there's some almost myth to him that he strikes a chord with people, there must be something else there. He must be getting at something bigger than just an action film, because action films come and go. But he doesn't. But anyway, let me just say this. I assume both of you are at least somewhat similar to my James Bond fanboyism. But what is your favorite James Bond?
I'm more of a Star Wars fanboy, but I like James Bond too.
Okay, that's equally.
Well, yeah, I'm quite fond of James Bond, especially because of the Scottish angle.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. He wasn't originally Scottish. I believe Fleming even created the. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think after they cast Sean Connery, then in on Her Majesty's Secret Service, this was written a little bit later. That's when they went into James Bond himself has a Scottish background. Maybe
That's right, yeah. It was brought in by the actor.
Maybe, okay, I'm going to Google this. I don't want to say something completely wrong.
Yeah, the writer was impressed by the actor, so he sort of concocted this half Swiss, half Scottish background.
Yeah, let me say this. I think we should say what our favorite films are. Maybe we can have two. I'll say this. I think On Her Majesty's Secret Service is actually a brilliant movie. And it's one that is probably not taken as seriously by a lot of people because it actually has George Lazenby in the lead role. It's not a Connery film. But it's really a great one. It has skiing. That's probably my favorite. Actually, whenever I go skiing, I have that theme music in my head almost invariably of dun 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 dun. It's one of the great themes. I can't, I guess every time I ski, I have that playing in my mind's ear or something. Well,
I like the bit where they lipstick their room numbers on his thigh under his kilt.
Yeah. Well, he's there in a kilt and he's investigating Blofeld, who's up to no good, and Blofeld has all these pretty girls in his mountaintop lair. And I think a lot of these girls haven't seen a man in ages. They only have this, stern German ward who's controlling them. I don't know why I just said that, but so yeah, that's a pretty funny scene. But also it has that, and then it attempts tragedy, because Bond actually gets married, and then. And then I hate to be giving this spoiler alert to a movie that was made in 1969, but anyway, he gets married, but then Blofeld in the end actually murders his wife, and it's a kind of it builds up a little bit of the tragedy of Bond in the sense that he has all these women, but they all kind of are ultimately all disposable. He has to be married to Her Majesty's Secret Service and his job, and he kind of in some ways can never have a true life. He can't have that bourgeois fantasy of marriage. He's actually always got to live in danger. Then I'll also mention this. I also like Moonraker, and that's probably one of the most maligned movies. People think it's the worst. Yeah. Like, if you look at rankings, like, Moonraker is, like, worse.
It's got Jaws in it. Come on, it's got to be good.
It's got Jaws. But, I just kind of like this whole... it has some cool scenes, but I think beyond that, I just kind of like this... this villain with a gargantuan fantasy. He wants to just, create a massive new eugenics program. and it's just kind of, I don't know, it's just, it seems like it's just such a compelling villain who is this, world visionary. He's not, as we were chatting about before we went on air, Bond villains aren't guys who just sell drugs or, they want to do a bank heist. That's not a Bond villain. A Bond villain wants to remake the world. And I think Hugo Drax is probably the ultimate example of that. But I've talked too long.
In a sense, all the Bond movies are sort of the whole inspiration for them comes from the Second World War and the reaction to Hitler. Because they're all versions of little Hitlers, aren't they?
You're absolutely right. I was talking with him. I think that is what it ultimately is. Because, it's another funny thing about Bond is definitely a creature of the Cold War. I mean, you can't separate him from that. But in a way, what these Bond villains are, it's not really the Russians or the Soviets who are the real enemy. It's almost the Nazis, who are defeated.
It's the third party.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, with that in mind, since I'm glad you mentioned that you named Moonraker as one of your favorites, because that means I can tell you all what my favorite Bond movie is without getting ridiculed. It's A View to a Kill.
Oh my God! That's a terrible one.
Or maybe I can't escape getting ridiculed. I don't know. But I like Christopher Walken. I thought, well, first of all, I like the theme song by Duran Duran.
Well, that's awesome.
The only James Bond theme song to hit number 1 on the charts.
Huh? That's a little bit of trivia.
There you go. Take that. And also, I liked Christopher Walken as Zorin, this crazed. I mean, speaking in terms of the kind of what y'all were talking about with the Nazi-like villains with this epic kind of grandeur or sweep, this vision of remaking the world.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's one of Christopher Walken's many, many very compelling roles, and I like him as an actor. He's a very odd and interesting.
Oh yeah.
An amusing kind of actor.
Hello,
to watch.
James Bond. No.
And I'm not saying it's the best in an objective sense, but I think maybe when I saw it in my, when I was 15 or so, and it came out, and I saw it.
That's why.
Yeah.
Well, he was a Nazi. Isn't that his character? Is that he was like a Nazi breeding experiment gone wrong or something?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or
and then
gone
he hooked
right
up with Grace Jones, yeah.
Right, and then
Yes,
then
that's
he
right.
has this.
Grace Jones is in that movie too.
Oh my God, you're reminding me of how awful this movie is. I remember seeing that when I was a kid, and James Bond was like investigating Zorin, and this was also Roger Moore's last role. And Roger Moore was probably pushing 60 at the time, and
he was quite old.
He was like investigating Zorin. And then he got in bed, and Grace Jones entered the bedroom, and he's like, "Oh, there's room for 2 in here." And I was like, I cannot believe I'm watching this like African, have sex.
And it wasn't his first black actress either. I think Live and Let Die was also another black girl there.
Roger Moore, he had to go. He had to go on these dangerous.
He really did his bit to sort of break down those racial barriers, I have to say.
He was sent on some dangerous missions for the sake of England. But how can anyone think that a 60-year-old man having sex with some Amazon African is erotic? I mean, I remember seeing that when I was a kid, and I was like, ah!
Everybody's got their quirks. I mean, you can't predict things like that.
Yeah, that is interesting. The racial element. They really, race was always there. Obviously, in You Only Live Twice, Bond. I think people have maybe kind of made an exception for East Asians. That's definitely less shocking. And there's the kind of Japanese mystique of beautiful women and things like that. So that's probably less shocking. But it's almost like once the decade of the 1970s hit. And, remember, on Her Majesty's Secret Service is a really kind of like traditional, it was very close to the novel. He got married to, a beautiful woman, and, her father was this, kind of mafioso guy, but very traditional in his way. And then you kind of, it's almost like the whole franchise went off the deep end, and Live and Let Die. He's having sex with black women. He's in Harlem and fighting gangbangers. I mean, it's kind of like it went crazy or something in the 70s.
Live and Let Die had very good stunts, I have to say, with the crocodiles and
yeah, that was awesome. Yeah,
several other stunts were quite amazing, which is one of the main things that people like about James Bond.
Well, when he was in the motorboat in the bayous and they were jumping, that was certainly great stunts. But they were ruined because they have that horrible sheriff who's like always commenting. Like they had this great stunt, and then he'll be like, "Oh, wee boy, that was amazing!" Like it was just terrible.
Kind of like a Smokey and the Bandit kind of moment.
Yeah, but.
Well, there's always a sense of Bond movies play into their audience, isn't there?
Well, yeah, they probably have to. They felt like they had to make
and that's what's going on now as well. People are going on about this latest Bond movie as if it's the best thing ever, but basically that's just because it plays to its particular audience at this particular time. Well,
that's true, but the one thing I will say is that if you look at some of those, not Timothy Dalton, but Pierce Brosnan Bonds in the 90s and early 2000s, he made some good movies like GoldenEye, but then that last one that had Halle Berry, and it was just a terrible film, and just, all the CGI, and it was just ridiculous. Like Bond was literally...
Is that the one with the invisible car?
Yeah, he has an invisible car, and also literally Bond is...
Like Wonder Woman.
Yeah, it's like Wonder Woman, yeah. And Bond is surfing and things like... I mean, it was just like, this is just not... And I think they kind of decided, like that, even though that movie made money, I think, the broccoli people, I forgot, it's actually Cubby Broccoli's daughter or granddaughter or something. Anyway, I think they did realize that, like, we just made a total piece of crap, and we've got to, like, reboot this
That's
thing.
The one with the Madonna song and the Korean guy who disguises himself as an Englishman.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
It is and like, he's in his car... Like they have a souped up Aston Martin, but it's absurd. It's like laser guided missiles and anti-missile missiles. I mean, it's just stupid. It's just none of this is real.
Yeah, but that's surely the whole point of Bond movies, is that kind of stupidity, all those kind of gadgets and unbelievable situations and over the top villains.
That's true.
That is the essence of Bond, really. You have this kind of character that makes all that more kind of plausible.
Well, it's true. It's got to be a balance, though. It's got to be a kind of implausible world, but then within that world, there's reality.
Yeah, you've got to strike a balance, and maybe some movies tend to go too far one way and some go too far the other way.
Yeah.
I think now the tendency is to sort of go into the kind of psychological side of the character and sort of capitalize on that.
Yeah.
And so
should we go into...
Well, before that, what's your favorite Bond movie, Colin?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my favorite Bond movie? That's a hard one. I'm quite fond of You Only Live Twice, because it's set here in my local neighborhood. And I do like the same one that you do with George Lazenby.
Yeah.
Also quite like Live and Let Die, because it's just I like the stunts, and in the same way that Andy likes the one with the Duran Duran soundtrack. I kind of remember that one growing up, and because I saw it in South Africa, so it sort of like lodged with me a lot more.
I'll just mention before we talk about Skyfall, the From Russia with Love is also a very good movie. It's a very how do I say? It's a more subtle movie. I mean, it doesn't even have huge stunts in it, but it's just a really well-written, kind of tightly compact drama.
I saw that quite recently, and I think maybe that's where they're trying to take it, because they've kind of grown tired of having all these overblown plots and these increasingly unbelievable scenarios. And From Russia with Love, it keeps everything quite basic, but at the same time, it is a very interesting movie.
Oh, yeah. And there's a scene where there's... it's funny, because I've actually read the book, too. And the book is a little bit different because it is the Soviet Union. It's not Spectre, the third party.
Yeah, it ends with James Bond's death.
Oh, right, yeah.
Sorry not to take you off track there, but it was just sort of an interesting. It just ends very suddenly with him being killed.
Yeah.
And then I think Ian Fleming brings him back later, maybe. But I think he had maybe initially planned just for that to be it.
Yeah.
For that to be the last book in the series.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. And also they have it's this the character of he's like Red Gant, who's this Irishman who goes over to the Soviet Union just simply because he goes over for the violence. He just wants to be involved with
Is this
it all.
the Robert Shaw character?
Exactly, and he's kind of a different character, but it is interesting. The film, they do something that. And this kind of gets to the whole Daniel Craig thing. They do something that probably couldn't be done anymore, is that Bond identifies the Soviet agent by the fact that he orders red wine with fish. And, it kind of... Bond
this is on the train, isn't it?
Yeah, it's on the train. It's on the Orient Express.
When he's impersonating one of Bond's contacts... he orders red wine with fish, and then so Bond obviously knows this guy is unaware of the.
He's no Englishman, and this kind of gets it. I mean, I think, and then also let me mention this: after Red Gant identifies himself by his gauche choice in wines, the fight that results is really a great piece of cinema. It's just a fist fight between Bond and Robert Shaw, and it's very serious and really compelling. So I thought it also kind of shows that you can really make cool Bond, action adventure.
Robert Shaw was a very interesting guy, wasn't he? He also did a lot of novels.
Yeah, a literary person, yeah.
Yeah, he wrote some very interesting novels. I haven't actually read any of them, but from what I've heard, they sound quite interesting.
Yeah. But I lost my train of thought there, but what was I... Oh, right. This gets to the whole kind of Daniel Craig thing, which I actually have this piece about that I'll probably post tomorrow. I was just writing it today, actually, the myth of James Bond. But, with Daniel Craig, and I actually like Daniel Craig. I think he's an interesting actor, and he's a very tough guy. But there's a degree to which he's not really an Englishman, and he's not. There's not the snobbery. He's kind of like Jason Bourne. As James Bond, and a lot of other people have made that comparison, that he's kind of a thug or kind of some tough kid or something who just happens to work for the British government. And could you imagine Daniel Craig identifying a secret agent by the fact that he had poor taste in wine? There's a kind of snobbery or really caring about.
That would be politically incorrect probably nowadays to go on about things like that. The old British concept of good form is now out of date.
Right. It's just you just have to be very polite. That's the new Britishness.
That's right. Anything goes is the new Britishness. Yeah.
There's a scene in Goldfinger where that sticks with me to this day. That was maybe a laugh out loud when I saw it on TV, where he of course there's some bikini clad babe that's just sitting around him, and then some associates of his come up to talk to him, and he slaps her on the bottom and says, "Run along now, darling, man talk."
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's Sean Connery. Yeah.
And she runs and she leaves, and talk about politically incorrect.
Oh yeah. Well, also, he's willing to brutalize women. He'll have to slap women around if he needs to get information out of them. Also, in Goldfinger, when he's with the woman, was it Jill Masterson or something? The woman who actually gets painted in gold, death by gold paint. He's there and he says something about the Beatles. He's like, I couldn't imagine, he's like drinking champagne that's not chilled. That's like listening to the Beatles without earmuffs, or, Again, Bond was kind of anti-counterculture in a way in the 60s. It's just a very different thing. You can't do that now. You can't imagine Daniel Craig, or Daniel Craig's Bond, enjoying the opera or
he probably listens to rap music.
Right, yeah.
Him and Moneypenny. And Felix Leiter too.
Right. He and Felix Leiter are, attending 50 Cent concerts, and their major villains will be, it will be kind of like a new reverse of the whole Nazi, Avatar as villain. It will be, they'll be going after white supremacists or people who want to take the Republican Party in dangerous directions or something, like threaten multiculturalism. Yeah, I mean, I could see it, sadly. Well, you actually wrote, Colin, about a black James Bond. I heard this rumor, although I don't know how seriously I take that.
Yeah, that's. I did mention that it might have just been a bit of sub-racist marketing to sort of get everybody thinking about Bond.
Yeah.
And, nothing succeeds like race when you want to get a message across.
Yeah.
So,
I have a hard time seeing that happening, even in today's world, I have to say.
Yeah.
I don't think we've turned that far upside down just yet.
Yeah, but you say that, but,
But who knows?
You say that while there's a black
might be wrong.
in the White House, so there you go.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, it is kind of funny. I remember Disney did a musical that was some kind of black princess involved in interracial romance. It was called The Frog Princess. And that, I don't know if it was well done or not. It had good songs, but it was very unpopular. I think it lost a lot of money. So
the prince was, I think, Arabian. So she was black and he was like from the Middle East or something.
Wow, that's great.
They're obviously trying really hard to appeal to Middle America there, aren't they?
Yeah, I think people want Snow White. Hollywood doesn't. If you look at like Captain America or something, they have the waspiest actor I've ever seen in my life. He makes me look Middle Eastern. But they, I think in some ways Hollywood does. They might want to depict, dispossession and things like that, but they also know they have to sell tickets, and they kind of don't want to push it a little too far. So I probably don't think they would do that.
But I'm just wondering where they can go now with James Bond after the latest movie, because they've gone into his psyche a lot, and they've kind of they've built the story on that.
Yeah.
And they've moved away from the gadgets and the overblown plots and the kind of the Austin Powers, Dr. Evil type of guys that want to take over the world. So isn't there a sense that they're sort of painting themselves into a corner more and more?
Well, this is kind of what I talk about in my piece that I'll publish soon. People noticed when they released the second trailer where they actually showed Javier Bardem as the villain. And I have to say, I really like Javier Bardem as an actor. I think he's really charismatic and interesting. And so I think he's almost worth like going to see it just for him. He's a very interesting guy. But people noticed right away that he was almost like Julian Assange in the sense that he had, there's the blonde hair. Of course, that's nothing new for Bond villains. But he's essentially a hacker, and he is leaking information on MI6. So there's this kind of idea that this is kind of like the Julian Assange villain. And that is a kind of that's an interesting thing of using a hacker as the mastermind villain thing. And I should say this: I don't want to give away. If you haven't seen the movie, maybe shouldn't be listening to this podcast at all. But if you look at it, essentially, Silva, who's the character, has a major grudge against M, whom he used to work for. M is played by Judi Dench, and so he is a mastermind hacker who talks about overturning markets and things like that. But it's all personal, and in some ways, if you think about that final scene where they go to Scotland and they're in Bond's hometown, his childhood home, it's totally personal. When Bond in Moonraker or something, Bond is trying to save humanity, for God's sake. Yeah, and in Skyfall, he's trying to save M. And there's something, I don't know, it's almost as if our society, we don't have villains anymore. We don't have a third way. I was maybe taking this too far. Maybe it is that Austin Powers and Mike Myers, like through that movie, they made the Blofeld figure just seem so ridiculous that you can't bring him back. If they have someone in a wheelchair with a bald head stroking a cat, people are going to start laughing. And
couldn't they just have Bond wiping out the alternative right? That would work, wouldn't it?
Well, that's what I was saying. Well, if they want to make a Bond movie where like racist or villains, I mean, I would definitely. I acted in college. I mean, I can do it. I'll
Go for it.
Yeah, I'm allergic to cats, but I could stroke.
Well, that won't work then.
Yeah, maybe a basset hound or something. I'll just be like
a chinchilla or something.
I'm sorry, Mr. Bond. Multicultural Britain will be doomed.
With what you're saying about the villain, I really liked Javier Bardem. I thought he was very compelling, very very interesting to watch. But you're right, though, that the stakes aren't ultimately. I mean, at first it looks like this is some earth-shattering thing, and he's going to expose all of these agents, and it's going to wreak havoc all across the world. But you're right. It eventually, and there is some really spectacular scene where there's a hearing being held, and M is played by Judi Dench is talking, trying to defend herself and whatnot, and then they burst in, and there's a lot of gunfire, and it's like I said, at that point it does seem like the stakes are high, but then they just go out into the countryside, and you're right, and the world and the future of the human race and all that stuff vanishes from the picture, and it's just about protecting this mother figure.
Yeah,
James Bond,
gets very personal.
Identified as an orphan. Protecting this mother figure against another agent who looked up to her as a mother figure who felt betrayed by her.
Yeah.
And so
it is a kind of almost like the man with the golden gun. Like Bond has met his match, with Silva. Silva's smarter than Bond. Kind of thing. But at the same time, Silva is pathetic because at the end of the movie, and this is a major spoiler, he wants to commit suicide and kill M. It's pathetic. It's it's not, Blofeld would be disgusted by Silva.
Yeah, sure.
And so I was just thinking, perhaps I'm just reading too much into this whole thing, but Bond is a child of the Cold War and thus a child of World War II. And maybe almost, in our kind of end of history world we live in, we can't imagine a great villain. There's liberalism, and there's maybe some criminals out there
who are the product of social injustice.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. We live in a Fukuyamian, Kujevian world. There's only criminals, and then there's liberalism. There's nothing else. So there can be no villain. Perhaps this is reading way too much into it, but if Slavoj Žižek,
or maybe he's like a Tyler Durden kind of figure, like Tyler Durden from Fight Club.
That would be interesting.
This anti-hero that you kind of sympathize with in some ways.
Well, that would be a compelling Bond villain, and I thought that's where they were going with Silva. But a true anarchist, like someone who just wants to bring the whole world down, who's a kind of Bane, the Joker or Bane or something. I think that would be pretty compelling.
Now, one other question. Since we've already spoiled one thing, and, people know if they don't want spoilers to switch off by now. There was something that really bothered me over the course of the movie when Bond hooks up with this Asian prostitute, beautiful woman. I don't know who she is. Look kind of like an Asian white mix, possibly.
Yeah, I think she
actress.
is. She's a French actress. I guess her character is Séverine. I forgot the actress' name, but I think she was supposed to be a half breed.
Yeah, a lot of people listening might hate me for saying this, but I think that can be a very aesthetically appealing combo.
Oh yeah,
the Asian white mix. It certainly is in her case.
Comment.
Yeah, without question, she's a beautiful actress, and I think I did look her up, and she is half Asian herself, and she, in that, I think it was a cool character. She was dressed, she was actually smoking, in that
Yeah.
scene when she's talking with
But
him.
and it looked like there was some kind of connection between the two of them. But then after she dies, and again, this is a spoiler.
Yeah.
Because of the cruelty of the villain, he reacts very callously and just kind of makes it into a joke, and we never hear anything about it afterwards. Did that bother you?
Yeah, I was not satisfied at all, and it got worse because he basically alerted MI6 to his location with his radio, and so immediate 2 minutes after he shot her, the helicopters arrived to arrest Silva.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, well, geez, it's not like, couldn't you have saved that girl? Or
I just was wondering if there was a satisfactory. Was that trying to show us that Bond is, like you say, really a thug at heart, and that he was just using her that whole time?
There is a kind of there is a structure to all of these stories, and one of the key components of any Bond story is they play a game, in the sense that they're always playing the casino tables or bridge or that it's kind of like the life is a game, and Bond gambles. I mean, I think that's, but also another key component to the structure of the story. There's obviously the villain, but another key component to the structure is that a woman must die. I mean, I think maybe with one or two exceptions, there's going to be some woman who, in a way, dies for Bond or is a collateral damage.
Yeah.
So
it's funny how we notice the women die, but hundreds of men die as well, and we don't notice it.
Well, but it's kind of special, he'll have sex with her, and then 5 minutes later she'll die, which of course sadly happens in the case of Safarine. So I don't know. I think maybe the way I would criticize it is that it was just kind of bad writing. It's like they didn't fully have a satisfying scene. I think that I liked her as an actress. I think it could have been interesting if she had been in there. She was a lot more interesting than like the new Black Moneypenny. I was like, oh, get that girl off the screen. She's so terrible. But yeah.
Does he whipped cream off her or something?
Oh, well, it's kind of ambiguous, but they do. I don't know. It's very ambiguous. Do you think that he ultimately had sex with Moneypenny? She kind of visits him in Beijing, and
yes,
yeah,
yes, I think so.
Yeah, but I guess they left it because you would assume in the Bond, part of the mythos is that he's never actually slept with Moneypenny. It's kind of always flirtation, but I don't know. This movie is becoming worse and worse now that we're talking about it.
Well, everybody's raving about it, but my contention is that basically the Bond franchise is sort of cannibalizing itself, and it's sort of painting itself into a corner, and it's
Hasn't it been doing that for the last 20 years?
Well, the key thing is you've always got to have this vacuous center, which is this enigmatic figure that we never get to know too well, and it's always the interesting stuff that's going on around him that. He's a kind of device for making all the absurdity more believable. And now they've kind of moved away from that, and they're saying, what about Bond himself? Let's focus on the hole in the donut. You know what I mean? So sort of overdeveloping the territory in the center, I feel. I
agree with you, Colin. I think Bond, it has to be a mystery of who he really is. And I agree with you. I don't think they should push it too far. Another thing, and I'll just mention this, perhaps we might have to put a bookmark in this conversation. We'll have another Bond episode. But, another classic structure to the story that you see even in Dr. No, you see it almost invariably, is that Bond has sex with the woman at the end credits. So, there are always these just hilarious one-liners, just trying to keep the British end up, sir, when he's in The Spy Who Loves Me. There's some other,
so
funny.
Corny.
Yeah, it is kind of like softcore porn, and it's hilarious and, kind of thing where the mission is done, and now it's time to kick back and, make a little love. Of course, in between the Bond films, they always break up and, she'll never heard from again. But anyway, it's kind of funny. I was thinking about this, and there's this built-in audience expectation for all of those. But you don't get that. And in a way, the only thing you get at the end is Bond holding his M mother figure. Like, it's like Daniel Craig and Judi Dench, who Judi Dench must be like 75 by now.
She's a Bond girl. Yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe it's almost like this is some PC Bond where he doesn't even doesn't even kind of make love to the woman at the end. He's just crying over mommy.
But what do you think about the new? What do you think about the new M being going back to the original? The old office with the.
I thought that was good. I thought that they were kind of trying to reset the series. They were like, let's. This reboot was essentially so that they can make Bond movies indefinitely and just everyone will go see them. So I in some ways I kind of liked that. They had wood paneling, they had a male M. That was that was better.
And then 20 years down the line, there'll be another Judi Dench figure. It'll be cradling his arms and weeping over. So
I don't know. It's a question whether they can make another good movie. I thought Casino Royale was a good film, but I think I guess that's kind of what we're in some ways getting to with this whole conversation that we've had, is that Bond is kind of he's an interesting creature of the Cold War. And he really exists in that context. And outside of it, he's just kind of an action movie franchise.
Yeah.
That they just
he's an anachronism.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just strange that he's still around at all.
Yeah.
I've thought for a while.
Well, he's always been very zeitgeisty, because you mentioned the Julian Assange connection with the present movie. And then with Live and Let Die, there's the blaxploitation element. And so they've always observed what's going on around, and then they've included that in the latest Bond movies. So obviously,
and Moonraker had the sci-fi space.
Yeah, because at that time,
from
Star Wars was very much the flavor of the day, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So whatever is the flavor of the day, they'll try and work into the latest Bond movie. That's that's obviously part of the formula. I mean, the key point about Bond is he is this British secret agent. And that kind of makes sense in a way from the period from the 1960s, even up until today, if you stretch it a bit. But I don't think you can really stretch that too far.
No, there's a good interpretation. There's a book called The Man Who Saved Britain, and I'm forgetting the author. I think his name might be Winchester, but it's a fun book, and it's essentially about Bond as this. How do I say, a kind of subliminal fantasy of the British Empire continuing. And so, obviously after the Second World War, it was American and Soviet dominated Earth, and Britain had gone from ruling the globe to being a B-grade power in just a generation's time. That was kind of shocking. And so the figure of James Bond is kind of a fantasy of the empire. He's going to exotic places and going around the world, and he, in some weird, maybe the greatest fantasy of all is that Britain is important. I mean, I don't mean to be insulting, but it's like, why is this British agent saving the world? It's almost like Sweden or something would be engaging in global diplomacy. And so it was a kind of fantasy of the revived British Empire, but not using that word. And I think that is. I think that interpretation is certainly interesting. It probably is accurate. But what is he now? I mean, I think I wrote, I think I wrote this a while ago with the last one when I was working at Talkie Mag. I think in some ways James Bond is they want some reassuring fantasy that the postmodern, politically correct, multicultural welfare state isn't as awful as they think it is, and that behind it all there's some, WASP who knows how to kick ass and will keep us safe or something. So that's kind of the Bond fantasy. Maybe that is the Bond fantasy. But at the same time, it doesn't make sense, because Bond has to be the character is very patriotic. He thinks of himself as an Englishman. He's not just a Briton. And
there's always a touch of irony about that as well. It's the kind of British ironic sense that's key to Bond, because what people are really interested in are all these kind of outlandish plots and these over-the-top villains. But the problem with that is it becomes kind of like farcical and unbelievable. But when you add in a little bit of irony and emotional distancing, then that can actually become more believable, and so it helps to make it more palatable.
I think that's true. And Bond is ironic about his identity. I think that's true. I remember, in Casino Royale in the book, I haven't read this in a while, but I believe even there he thinks about quitting the service and is kind of like, well, it's just a game of cowboys and Indians or something like that. It doesn't matter which side you're on. He has a kind of irony about it. But at the same time, he is a chauvinist and a patriot.
Bit of a snob as well.
Yeah, and he's a snob, and of course, snobbery doesn't make sense at all in our context. What snobbery about what?
Well, politically, we've moved away from snobbery, but it's still very inherent in human nature.
Oh, sure.
It was just a different kind of snobbery now. It's like the snobbery of political correctness.
Right. Yeah. When he's going after the alt-right and the new film Die Another, or what is a great, Die, Race Never Dies, or something like Race Will Die with Bond. I'm thinking, and every Bond movie has to have Die, Live, or Gold in the title. So,
Goldenballs.
Yeah, the golden ball. That's a good the Golden Ball. The title will have nothing to do with the plot whatsoever. It'll just be called Golden Ball, and then he'll battle racists in America who are trying to not reach out to Hispanics in the coming election.
Gotcha.